Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to present our work. This is going to be our first time presenting these results, first time presenting this project externally, so I'm excited to get your feedback. This paper, first of all, I want to thank Penn for funding this research. We also received funding from the Program of Economics and Policy at George Mason. This work is joined with my colleague Tesseri at Questrom, as well as James Cooper, who is a law professor at George Mason. What's really interesting is that he actually was at the FTC when the YouTube settlement came down, and so he has an insider perspective and just a lot of great institutional knowledge about this law and how the FTC interpreted it in this case. So the big research question that we're trying to look at is, what is the impact of personalization? So thinking about personalized advertising and some amount of personalization of the user interface on content creation. In order to study this question, we're going to use a natural experiment, which is the FTC's YouTube settlement from January of 2020. And YouTube, the way that YouTube responded to that settlement was to deactivate all forms of personalization on its website when it comes to made-for-kids content. So in order to study this, we're going to look at 5,400 top channels from the US on YouTube. And what we're going to find is that made-for-kids content production falls by something like 10% after this policy. So in terms of motivation for this, the broad question is, how does personalization help content creators and users? So if you're a content creator, in most cases, your activities are being supported by ad revenue. And several researchers have looked at the differential of ad revenue, with identifiers and without identifiers, including myself. And most of us find that ad revenue is going to be like 2 to 3 times higher when you have these identifiers. And a lot of the public discussion really emphasizes the role of targeting in causing these prices to be higher. But there's some very basic things like the ability to measure the effectiveness of advertising and optimize and cap the number of times that a user sees the same impression that also drives the value there. So ad revenue is certainly kind of top of mind when we think about this. But we can also think about just improving the match between users and content and improving the user experience. So if you don't have any sort of identifiers on a platform, then you can't do any sort of personalization, like personalizing the recommendations or personalizing the search results. You can't have feedback and social interaction with creators and with each other using comments. And there's even basic functionality that gets broken, like the ability to curate your own playlists. So, at the top of this slide is personalization, but the flip side of this is privacy. And this is something that regulators are increasingly thinking about when it comes to children. Frankly, when I started this project, probably the part that I was least excited about is that this deals with the privacy of children. I think that's something that we agree as a society is pretty intrinsically important. But this YouTube natural experiment gives you a really great research opportunity to see what happens when you go to a pure privacy world without any form of identifiers. And as we continue to work with this project, we started to see some consequences of this. And some recent changes have really taken on this issue of children's privacy. So in the US, the proposed privacy law would ban targeted ads for children. This is something that President Biden has talked about quite a lot. In the EU, the recently passed Digital Services Act bans targeted ads for children under 18. And in light of our work, we've seen that this is going to have consequences for content creators, which are businesses of all sizes. And consequently, this is going to have consequences for the content that children do enjoy. So let me tell you a bit about the YouTube COPPA settlement. So maybe in this room, kind of this generation, most of us still think of TV as TV. But for those of us with children of the right age, YouTube has kind of taken over this role of television. So it's a top content destination for children. It's taking up something like 20% of global digital ad spend. So YouTube really is a gorilla in this space. It's taking something like 190 million of the almost $1 billion in global kids digital ad spend. Of the top YouTube channels, so the top 10, 4 of them are directed at children. And so the natural experiment we're going to look at is this consent decree that came down from the FTC regarding COPPA, where Google had to pay $170 million. And this is notable in itself because this is the largest COPPA fine ever. So COPPA is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. It requires parental consent for using personal information of children under the age 13. And YouTube, for a long time, tried to say, we're a platform, we don't take ownership of what's on our platform, we require that people are 13 years or older to sign up for our platform, so, this is, exempt from COPPA. And one of the things that I think turned the FTC against them was parts of YouTube were then marketing themselves to children's advertisers, saying, this is really a top destination for children, this is where you should advertise. So, FTC noticed this and came down on them very hard. So, what was the outcome of this? The outcome, in addition to the fine, is that Google took a pretty scorched earth approach to this. So they said, we're not going to have any personal identifiers for advertising. So this means that advertising is going to lack, the full measurement, frequency capping, behavioral targeting capabilities it would otherwise have. You're just going to have contextual targeting. You're not going to have any personalized search or personalized recommendations. So these engines kind of had to be rebuilt without personal information. This disabled the ability to do comments, disabled the ability to do playlists, and this is something that happened in January 2020 and was not just rolled out to the United States, it was rolled out globally. So the YouTube creator community was very distraught about this because they thought that this would have enormous consequences for their business models and the revenue that they're able to make from their content, and even just basic abilities to interact with their customers. And so, they coined this term of the COPPAcalypse, which is in our title. So if you go onto YouTube, you can see a lot of videos of creators that are concerned about the changes that are coming, and calling this the COPPAcalypse. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Who determines what's made for kids? So who determines what's a funny memes for kids or for adults? So it's not really they don't know. So this law applies to whom and by whom? So I don't understand a little bit. So it's obvious maybe, but then how is it implemented in practice, basically?
Yeah, it's a really highly not obvious thing because something that's directed at a 13-year-old versus a 14-year-old could be very similar, and that's part of one of the complaints of the COPPAcalypse is just how is this determination going to be made. So in practice, the way that it works is that Google has an algorithm that classifies all the content and as whether it's made for kids, and it'll do things like based on whether it's cartoons or well, they don't tell you the whole input of the algorithm because it's a secret, but that's the kind of key thing, number one. The other thing is that creators are supposed to classify their own content, whether it's made for children. So obviously they have some discretion there, but YouTube the FTC made very clear that it's not just YouTube that's on the hook for these violations, it's actually the creators themselves. I think the fine was, in excess of $40,000 if they were caught kind of making made for kids content and not properly designating as such. So the combination of these two things is what determines what is made for kids content. Yeah, Dave.
Related to this, maybe this is for an idea for a different project, but do you see actually creators now shifting? So if you're on the board or I'm 13, maybe 14, whatever, you have the incentive to say, okay, I'm just going to make it just a little bit older age rate so I actually get out well. So I can honestly say it's not made for kids and hopefully get past the Google classification as well.
Yeah, so I'm going to show you some evidence that's consistent with that. You know, one thing that I thought of that kind of is in that vein is one way that you can make your content, you know, more clearly designated towards an older audience is to just add some cursing to the videos, and that's not costless because if you curse a lot, then actually YouTube will change the sort of advertisers that you get. So yeah, that's one of the things we hope to do with this project is do some text analysis, and that might be something that comes out of it.
I mean, it'd be nice, I'm sure they're not gonna give it to you, but you can try. If Google will give you whatever you know, if they have an index in their algorithm that tells you where you are, and let's say you're above, you know, above a certain level on that index, you're made for kids, you're just below it, you're not, it'd be great to see that distribution before and after it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we do get the binary classification from the YouTube API about whether it is classified as made for kids, but we don't get the continuous measure. It would be a lot of work to construct that, but I agree that that would be interesting to think about. Yeah.
Snag Hal variant enough, maybe he'll give it to you.
Is it on Google Trends? Probably not. But yeah, maybe we talk to Hal about that. Oh,
Sorry.
sorry.
So this kind of combines a couple of the questions. I'm wondering why was it YouTube that they went after? Like you'd think, you know, maybe this is too recent, but TikTok is the first order thing. It seems like 100% of TikTok should be in violation of COPPA, as best as I understand. I guess the relevant thing is I don't know how you, since everything is for under 13, give or take. There's no other stuff there, so there's no playing games about changing what your age is or any of that other stuff. Why was this the first one?
Isn't it that it's illegal? I mean, they do it, but kids cannot have TikTok if they are under 13, I think. They cannot.
Oh, so they just lie about their age.
Yeah,
Oh.
but they cannot.
Well,
Instead, YouTube, you can, I guess. I don't know what's the legal stance. You have a legal co-author on the paper, so you should know better. But I think
He's an economist.
if you're 10, say, you can watch YouTube,
I see.
but if you're 10, you cannot go on a TikTok account. That's my understanding of the law, but maybe. Of course they do. That's a different reason.
I think officially you can't have a Google account if you're less than 13. I mean, a parent needs to sign and agree, right?
But YouTube, you don't need a Google account just to go on the web.
But you do need like a social media account generally to have, you know, engage with social media, and then in most of these platforms, they say that you if you're under 13, you can't enroll. So, you know, people lie about their age.
Just to clarify, how are these restrictions implemented? So if I now do log in with a YouTube account and I go to some made for kids content, is everything still disabled for me or no?
Yeah, so that's one of the kind of controversial parts of this is, you know, creators said, well, if the teacher is looking at our content, then, you know, maybe it's okay to show them targeted advertising. We don't have to lose all of this. And like the implementation of this was pretty scorched earth. So
it's on
regardless
video
of who the
level.
person is,
Okay.
in part because it is hard to verify whether you're 13 or over, and COPPA makes that quite difficult. Google just says you're not going to be able to get all this functionality.
So can I change, so suppose I made a video, a kids video before 2020, right? And then can I change the label or what, the MFK label after the law?
Yeah, so you can always go in and change the classification of your content, but there is, you know, that's not risk-free. If it actually is directed at children and you say that it's not, the FTC has threatened fines on the order of $40,000 for doing that. Okay. So, you know, they're motivated to not do that.
And this may be a smaller part of content, but what about things that work the other way, which is the design for adults? If you think about the Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoons, you can have material that is both targeted at adults, but would be unobjectionable for children.
Yeah, so there's tons of gray area here, and so, you know, we're going to look at one virtue of pulling this data 2 years after the fact is that it's somewhat settled what has been classified as what. But, you know, one of the other edge cases that's related to that is like SpongeBob SquarePants. So probably most of us would think, you know, that's made for children, but the audience that watches that, like, it was, you know, they're now 20 years old, so they think of it now as like, you know, directed at people over 13. So yeah, that's a challenge, and I'm going to speak to the one part of it, which is this pivoting point to non-made for kids content that Aviv brought up. But that's all I can say about that at this stage.
So Garrett, James, your co-author, has put in the chat FTC guidance to channel owners for people to decide if their YouTube content is made for children. Do you want to get James in on the details of COPPA, or it's up to you?
I mean, I think the takeaway is that there's a list of 10 things, ish, that, and one of them is, is it cartoons? Does it have bright colors? And, some of the creators on the borderlines of that this makes them grouchy, because it is hard. But, there's a sense in which some of these things are pretty unambiguously going towards children. And the FTC won't tell you this, but that's probably the cases that would be brought. Would be the stuff that's pretty
And
unambiguous.
COPPA applies to the content and also to the ads that can be shown next to that content.
Yeah. So actually, is one of the things that I like about this project is I got the question yesterday at dinner. What would the world look like without behavioral targeting? Wouldn't the market just adjust and things would be fine? So this provides a nice opportunity to test that and see actually what happens. Given that a lot of money is being spent in this market and there's some ability to adjust. Okay, so I'll try to briefly tell you just an anecdote of one company in this space called COPPAcalypse. So COPPAcalypse, it has 195 videos. It describes itself as creating high quality educational videos on math and science. And it has 22 million cumulative views as of about a year ago, and about 60,000 different subscribers, so it's a reasonable size account. And the reason I know about this company is it's pretty loud talking about these changes from COPPA. So they posted on Twitter, this is what's happening to our ad rates, our CPMs. You'll know that the y-axis is missing here, but you kind of see that when COPPA is hitting, that the prices are starting to flatline. And so, what did this company do? They decided to exit the market. So they just decided that we're not going to be producing our content anymore because our ability to monetize it has been, we expect it to be hurt quite a lot. So that's obviously an extreme case and an anecdote, so we want to try to see what's happening in data. So in order to study this question, we need to start with a list of channels on YouTube to be able to gather data. And so we partnered with a company called Social Blade that has an API that allows you to do these things. That allowed us to identify the top 100,000 channels on YouTube by subscribers. And it's also going to allow us in the future to collect data for more channels on daily total views and daily total new subscribers. And for this, we have Penn to thank. This is, this did cost thousands of dollars, so thank you for making this crucial ingredient to our research possible. And so once we have this list, we can feed it into the YouTube data API, which has the virtue of being free. Kind of thinking about the discussion yesterday about using the data that's thrown off by these platforms and that's made available to us as researchers to try to understand the consequences of policy. And so the data that we get from this at the video level is pretty rich, but we're going to be interested in a few key variables. So the critical one is the time that the video is going to be released. But there's some other information like the duration, the language, the category of the video, and critically whether it's classified as made for kids. And then we have some outcome variables like views and likes, but the limitation of that is that is going to be current as of the time of collection. So if I collect this today, it's going to be the number of total views for this video as of today. It doesn't give me that historical view, which would allow us to, I think, more cleanly at the video level, try to look at these demand metrics. But we do have this Social Blade data at the channel level that gives us a sense of these metrics that we can fall back on instead. So the current sample that we started with for this is of about 5,000 different YouTube channels. We focused on American ones to start with, and we focused on 3 categories, which are film animation, education, and entertainment. And these are the top 3 Made for Kids categories, and they account for a large majority of the content that's made in that Made for Kids Made for Kids content. So with these 5,000 different YouTube channels, we get 1.8 million videos. We gathered data that's starting a year and a half before the natural experiment, and then we look at a year after the COPPA settlement. And one of the things that we're going to come back to as I go through the results here is that we separate the channels into 3 different types. Number 1, channels that have no MFK or Made for Kids content prior to the COPPA settlement, and that's about 3/4 of channels, almost 4,000. And then the second group is the pure Made for Kids group, and that's about 13% of the sample at 700 channels. And then at 800 channels, you've got these channels that are doing a bit of both, which is about 14% of our sample. So to give you some summary statistics here, the average channel is loading something like 2.5 videos every week, and the average video is lasting 15 minutes. If we look at the share of MFK contents, this is the top right here. By construction, it's basically the Made for Kids stuff is almost 100% Made for Kids, but the mixed stuff, it's on average 24% of the content is Made for Kids, but that can vary from higher and lower. And to just give you some descriptive statistics to give you a sense of how this market looked like, so that we can use our gifts of ocular regression. This is plotting on the left-hand side non-Made for Kids production, so the total number of videos on YouTube by the sample that's not Made for Kids, and then on the right-hand side the total production that is Made for Kids. And you can see that pre-COPPA there's an increase, especially on the side of the non-Made for Kids content. And one of the things I want to direct your attention to in my laser pointer that doesn't work.
It does.
It does?
The top button was
The bottom,
bottom. Sorry.
There's a bottom button.
One in the middle. No, there's
the lower one,
north and south.
one of the buttons.
One of those buttons is a laser pointer.
Well, I'm
It's
afraid
not a very good one, mind you.
idiot
Under any
proof,
circumstances.
So my point is that you see these dips that happen like right at December. So there's a periodic trend. There's a periodic thing where like right after the holidays there tends to be a reduction in video creation. So we want to kind of separate that out. But I think there's a pretty clear pattern where there's just this level decrease in Made for Kids content that happens after January 2020. That's not happening in the non-Made for Kids content. Yeah, Coleman?
I should have asked this earlier. Is the experiment, there's 2 things at least going on with the experiment. There was that drop in advertising rates, so the advertisers are responding, and the creators are worried about getting sued or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So which, are we going to be able to parse these things out, or it's some joint? In other words, they're 2 very different things.
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges of this project is that there's multiple treatments, and I think it's going to be hard to disentangle those. I mean, certainly, maybe this is coming from my past research that's influencing my thinking here, but I do think that the first order thing is if the ad prices are falling on the order of like 40 or 50%, then if that's your income, that should affect your activities. So I do think that's first order. One of the things that may speak to this personalization story is the relative concentration of views of content by top creators versus more long tail creators. You might expect that if you lose the ability to do personalized search and personalized recommendations, that could be hit. But that's something we haven't been able to look at yet. That's something that, one piece of data that speaks to it. If people have other ideas about how to disentangle those, that's something we're really interested in thinking about more.
So Garrett, what's the vertical line here? What exactly is the event here?
So in September 2019, the FTC holds a news conference saying, thou shalt indicate whether your content is made for kids, and YouTube puts out a video saying, basically all the things that I said were gonna happen here, it's basically saying this is all gonna kick in January 2020. So that's what the red line is indicating.
September or January?
So September is the announcement, and then January is when all these transitions of turning off personalized
I
advertising.
can tell, is the line January or September?
I mean, I hope it's January. I had to put that in manually because it wasn't in there, but yeah,
January.
it's January.
Right, but just going back to the previous comment, right, the concern about the fear of being sued, in principle, that should have been once the law goes into effect, and then once YouTube gets sued, and maybe there's word of the settlement. So I would have expected, September is kind of where you get more of that effect.
Yeah, so I think that's something that we're thinking about in this project is like, that we are concerned about anticipatory changes because of this. And maybe that's why you start to see some leveling off in MFK that's not happening in the non-MFK prior to the deadline. Still this there's this level shift that we're going to be estimating that I think is a.
It just seems to me that the
We can be
clear break
underestimating.
around there really does it does seem to me like it's more about the advertising and less about the fear of being sued. I mean,
I see. Yeah, I mean,
I just don't see why the fear of being sued should be a sharp drop right at January.
Well, I mean, I don't think the FTC would, come in November and say, these all changes are going to happen in January, but we got one of these bad companies, but it certainly could affect their beliefs, and because content is an investment you're doing. Some of the stuff is pretty instantaneous, but some of it, especially if you're making cartoons, like there's some lag. You could change your investment in content creation, and that could cause some anticipatory reduction in the number of videos. So I think we're going to underestimate when we focus on this start January deadline. Yeah, Max.
Yes, so when I'm seeing this, I'm a little bit puzzled because I would think, if people are confronted with this and they're like genuine content creators, they might perhaps, just try to hang on, and then if they are really hurt by a reduction in the revenue, they would, gradually drop out. So what I would expect is essentially, a change in the trend, another sudden drop, because what I see here is clearly people that can make very, very good calculations of what is going to happen to them, and then essentially, go out of the market. So, and people that are able to basically, do this are perhaps not your average content creator, right? Maybe they are people that have, a very specific reason to exit the market almost immediately. So I'm just wondering to what extent do you think is this representative, or is this like,
Can I ask a related question? Are they really exiting the whole business, or are they moving to other platforms?
Exactly, or are they shifting? Yeah.
So the first question was, I think, was focusing on like, if you're a creator, there's uncertainty in just what the consequences of this policy are going to be, and so there may be some extent that you take a wait and see approach.
Except you're a very informed player, right? And then what does this tell us about the people that are exiting? I have no answer to this, but I'm just, intuitively, and maybe I'm completely wrong and naive, I would expect a different thing to happen here.
I mean, there's probably, there's different sophistication of firms. I'm not sure how easily I'll be able to map that on here, but I think, there's collective uncertainty of what's going to happen here. That's part of why we're doing research on this. We don't know either just what the consequences are going to be.
No, yes.
So,
I think it's it's interesting to see a sudden jump and then everything basically levels off immediately. You don't see a trend afterwards. I think of slowly dying businesses that clinch on to what they are doing and are forced out because they realize, okay, in the new market environment, I cannot make it.
yeah, so, I hesitate to bring this up because it's a pain in our butt and it's distracting, but, the other thing that happens in March 2020 is COVID. And then YouTube starts to raise our children, so there's probably an increase in the number of views. The data I've seen actually is not this massive increase you'd expect if YouTube is raising our children, but there is an increase there. So yeah, there's another shock that happens, and so that complicates this wait and see approach story too. So Want to try to, once we get the demand side data, we'll hopefully have more to say about that part of it. Yeah, Tommy.
Yeah, another kind of related question is, do you have any information or proxy on what the YouTubers' other sources of revenue say? Okay, so I have a 2-year-old kid, and he just cannot get enough of one YouTuber's song. His name is Blippi, by the way, and I just checked on Spotify just now. He has a lot of songs, right? And I just checked on Spotify really quickly. He has a lot of albums after 2020.
That's interesting.
So I don't know whether that's related to that or not. And yeah, I think the question I'm trying to ask is, if you have that kind of information, can you see whether they kind of shift, or is that change of law affect the type of YouTuber that has other source of income less than those YouTubers that solely rely on ads from YouTube? And also, do they try to shift the type of content that would be more transferable to other platforms like Spotify?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first thing I noticed, I didn't actually answer Pinar's question, which is the shifting to other platforms. I do think that because YouTube is this gorilla in this marketplace, it is the #1 destination for made for children's content, that I think it's harder to have that substitution. I mean, you maybe be able to go to social media, but Facebook too also says that you have to be over 13, and I don't think that there's this grand uprooting of this content to Dailymotion or whatever this other kind of competing platform to YouTube is. Plus, I mean, if that massive thing did happen, I think, and it was not respecting COPPA, I think the FTC would be coming after them, and they recognize this too. So, so that's the previous question. The next question is about pivoting revenue sources. So this is hard to collect data on, but there is, I know of another paper from some people back at Northwestern that have looked at this for another policy change. Actually, it wasn't on YouTube, it was on Patreon. So basically, some of these YouTube creators, they get part of their funding from Patreon. I forget the details of the natural experiment, but something happened to Patreon where there was a reduction on the order of 10% from revenue from there, and that caused some observable substitution. So one thing is more native advertising on YouTube, so kind of creators calling out, and thanks Giovanna for sponsoring this episode of Tommy's Toys or something like that. But we haven't collected data on that. I mean, coming back to this issue of what is the net effect on revenue, that should offset some of the revenue loss, and so that should maybe dampen down some of these reductions that we're showing, but that's what we're going to look at, is the net effect on production. Yeah, Max?
Another thing that is now unrelated to this specific graph, but that just came to my mind. So are these companies targeting the kids or the parents?
The advertisers or the content creators?
Oh, the advertisers, right? So ultimately, they're targeting the parents. Now, I'm shifting, so basically maybe I can get the job done somewhere else of targeting the parents. So
Sure, they're targeting.
Yeah, but you can, sorry?
I'm not sure they're targeting the parents. I mean, some of it's surely targeting, think of, sweet cereals back when they were, to get the kid excited, say, I want that, right?
Yeah, you can always target parents in myriad ways on advertising. But it does, so one of the things, we've talked to kids content creators, and we've asked, what does personalized advertising mean for children? And I think the response was kind of like Aviv, you can still show TV ads, YouTube ads for sweet cereals and toys and that sort of thing. The kind of behavioral targeting that was happening, we think that was actually directed at the parents and not the children. And some of that may be a little bit of, stories you tell yourself to feel better about this, but I think that's actually kind of plausible, right? Children aren't probably spending a lot of time on commercially relevant websites that are then going to be retargeted, for instance, on YouTube on the basis of. So I think they have some basis in fact to actually say that the retargeting and some of the behavioral targeting that's happening was actually targeting the parents.
And perhaps, we should let you go because you have to present your results, of course. But supposedly, the law was introduced because there's stuff that our kids see online that we don't want them to see. So because of self-harming thing, addiction. These are all the problems that motivated the adoption of COPPA in the first place. So, of course, if I tell you this, I already know you're going to tell me I'm not going to be able to analyze the benefits on that side. But a different question. If some content is legitimate, and these are kids under the age of 13, so parent guidance is somehow still there. So the Socratic, whatever it was called, example, which is educational content that we all agree would be a good one, why don't they switch into a different business model like subscription-based? The families will be happy to pay $10 a month if that's such good content for the kids, and instead we get rid of the bad content because they don't have alternatives. So isn't that the intended effect of the policy to see some drop in the creation of, so I don't know, maybe the policy is too draconian, but how can I see the distinction between content that we didn't want our kids to watch, precisely because it leads to this addiction behavior, self-harming of teenagers, and there is lots of anecdotes there too. You can give me an anecdote about one particular developer, but I can give you a lot of other examples that led actually to the adoption of this law. So how can we distinguish? Is there a way, perhaps, in your data to distinguish between the type of content that goes down, etc.? Because this is going to go more to the core of the intended effects. So maybe that's even the intended effects of the policy. I don't know. I just don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think when part of what interests us here is I think saying something indirectly about like the welfare of children through the creation of this content, and so there's some sense if you're just getting rid of a bunch of crap, then like that doesn't really affect the welfare of children.
No, it would improve if that was.
It would, yeah, it could
if that was
potentially
leading
improve.
to addiction. I mean, this is that's why COPPA
I
came.
wouldn't say improve if, I mean, you can
If
go
that
to
was
behavioral model,
addiction.
they were watching it, right? I mean, you can go into behavioral model, but I think it's safer for you to say, which I think what you said in the beginning, of saying, look, I'm measuring one side of this. Yes, content is lost, but I'm right now not doing the trade-off, right? So even if content's lost, we could say this is still a beneficial program for all this other stuff that we're trying to prevent. We just need to know that there is some potential, some cost. We don't know what that is, and going against Tomas's, say that's the next paper, but
So
I'm perfectly fine with you just showing that. Why don't you show us those results? I think we've held
Yeah.
you up long enough.
well, I will say the two parts because I think it is important to respond to that. So we're so far focusing, and the results I'm going to show you today is focused on quantity, but you would expect that reducing the amount of funding could affect quality as well. So we hope to have more to say on that in the future. So, and the second thing I would say here is that one thing that speaks to this, which I'll show you, is I'll show you the difference in effects by entertainment versus education, and probably the education stuff we think is more valuable to children and parents, and we're going to show you that there's a reduction there too. Okay, so. And also, I guess before I show you regression analysis, I'll just kind of show you another picture that kind of tells the story. So we're starting the world with these three different categories of creators based on their production up to January 2020. Then I'm going to show you what happens after January 2020. And so, you stay within these three categories, but there's also a fourth category which emerges, which is that you don't have videos, so you just basically exit the marketplace for at least the course of a year. And you can see that, as a share of MFK content, the share that exits is larger relative to the rest. And then the other thing I'll draw your attention to is that there's a good chunk of these mixed creators that actually move to doing non-made for kids content. So it seems to be two stories, at least from the looking at the data as a whole. There seems to be some exit and seems to be some pivoting. Okay, so let's try to look more formally at what the results are. So the empirical approach we're going to take is founded on differences in differences using channel and wig fixed effects, where the treatment group is going to be the made for kids content and the mixed content separately, and the control group is going to be the non-made for kids channels. We're also going to look at alternatives to get a robust sense of what's going on here. So the first one we're going to do is a panel differences approach, and all that's doing is saying the treatment group is, for instance, made for kids channels from 2019 to 2020, and the control group is going to be their previous year. So that's going to account for seasonality, and obviously isn't going to have this COPPA effect in it. So I think it's also a sensible control group. And then the last thing we're going to use is this synthetic differences and differences, this extension of synthetic controls to differences and differences. That's a recently out of paper from Archangelski et al. And Susan Athey and other co-authors. We're going to take a look at that. It's something that we can use. It requires actually, the off-the-shelf version requires a complete panel. And so we're going to be able to show that for some outcomes, not our video level outcomes, because in some weeks there's no data to feed, and so the panel isn't complete. All right, so let me show you the results here for these 5,400 US channels in the top 3 MFK categories. So the first result here is that we're looking at log videos per channel per week. And for the Made for Kids channels, post-COPPA, there's an additional 13 or 14% reduction in the videos that are being released per week relative to the pure non-MFK channels. For the mixed channels, there's a reduction of about 11%. And then in terms of this pivoting story I've been previewing, we look at the share of MFK videos. So by construction, this is 100% prior to COPPA. For the MFK channels, this falls by 2%, so it goes from like 100% to 2%. But the fall is larger for mixed channels, so it's starting out on average at about 24% of their content is from MFK. It falls by 7% or 7 percentage points. And I think this is a pretty intuitive story that, like, if you're creating content for both children and not children, if the revenue from the Made for Kids content falls something like 50%, you're going to want to pivot to the content that you're creating more for adults. But if you're creating videos with nursery rhymes, it's kind of hard for you to make that pivot, and so that's why you see a much smaller change there. Yeah, Max?
Sorry, just a very quick question. So on the flow chart that you showed us, essentially, there's no entry.
Yeah, so I focus more on exit. It is a good question. What's happening to entry? We should look more at that. It's a good point. Okay. And then the last column here is just what happens to the length of videos. Here it seems there's no significant evidence for the whole that there's a change.
Would you have the pre and post trends? Do you have a slide of that or no?
It's in the paper.
Oh.
I'm not going to show you that. I mean, part of why we're interested in doing this thing is to get a robust view.
Yeah.
And I think, I wouldn't give it an A+ in terms of this being equal pre-trends, but it's not terrible. It's probably more of a B or something. So because of that, we want to try to take a couple looks at this to see how robust it is. So the top row here is this panel differences estimator. So let's compare Made for Kids content, or in this case, mixed channel content, to how it performed the year prior. And again, over here, we see a reduction of about 10%. So it's smaller in this case. So it's saying the number of videos is falling by about 9%. We also look at synthetic difference and difference, and that tells us that our estimate is 11%. So we've got 13, 11, and 9. So that's why we're saying it's pretty robustly about 10%. Share of MFK videos, this is falling again by I guess a little less than 2% in this case. And then here we see evidence that there's actually an increase in the length of videos. So we're still trying to nail, kind of once we've satisfied ourselves about satisfying pre-trends, just what direction that's going. And then for mixed channels, there's a negative estimate here. It's no longer statistically significant, but there is this. It is actually negative for the synthetic difference and difference approach. But then you see this pivot. So maybe it's possible that you have less of an impact here on the total, but in terms of Made for Kids content, because of this pivot that's happening, there's still a reduction in net content going to children. And then again here we see an increase in video length relative to the year before. So that's kind of the main effect that we're starting this paper with, at least for this sample. Then we've sort of previewed this material in our discussion, but we want to break this down by categories for the reasons that came up in my discussion with Tommaso. So we're going to look at education, entertainment, and film and animation. And so we see a reduction that's kind of similar to our main effect of about 10% here for education. There's this same pivoting story. The effect is larger, at least according to these estimates, in the entertainment category. And then this film and animation, you see negative estimates that are not statistically significant. We're not sure why this is. I mean, we speculate that to the extent that this content is previously made cartoons or basically like film previews, like film advertisements, then this stuff is not going to have much of an effect because just YouTube is a distribution channel among other distribution channels for these things, and they're being created by large entertainment companies that have a diversified source of revenue. So maybe that's why that's happening, but we really need to dig into that more to understand if that's a real story.
How is song categorized here? Does it fall into education?
How does songs?
Yeah.
I mean, there is a music category. By construction, we didn't gather that data yet. We can. So yeah, we could look at that in the future.
Isn't it in entertainment maybe?
Well, some of it will be. I mean, entertainment is really a big umbrella. So if you're creating content that has a bunch of sing-songs in it, you may put it into entertainment. So there's more nursery rhymes, and it probably is that. I think like a lot of the music categories, like music videos. So maybe there's a little less of that. For made for kids content, but
Is there
we
a
haven't looked at
way
that yet.
of turning these numbers into something which is of economic significance, by which I mean, so drop in 10% of education, does it mean that the average kid goes from watching 30 minutes of this thing to 27 minutes a week, and so, okay, we don't care too much about it, or they go from 20 hours to 18 hours, so there is so is there a way of understanding what these drops are?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I agree that that's interesting. I mean, I think there's one part that we can do is once we get this daily level, channel level view data, then we can start to unpack what that is. I mean, there's a big hammer that comes in, which is COVID. So we can start to do that. I mean, we don't see the duration of how much you're watching the video for, so we can't do this 30-minute thing without making assumptions. Yeah, so I'd be interested to hear more ideas about the trying to think about more of a welfare calculation here. I think a couple things that make this challenging is one, there's no prices, and I think one thing that makes this a little hard to from an external validity point perspective is that children really do have different preferences for repeated content than adults, right? Our toddlers are watching Baby Shark a million times, and that's why it's one of the most watched videos on YouTube, but that's much less fun for adults, so that could be something different. Yeah, Max.
Are you a little bit concerned if it would not be better to take as a control group, let's say, YouTube Kids channel in another legislation? Because to the extent that there are substitution effects going on, post-treatment, I might be concerned that this might affect. I'm not so much concerned.
This is happening globally, so we can't say, there's a reduction in the US that's not replicated in France because it goes through the whole world.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, one place we want to take this next is to try to upgrade the differences models with some level of matching. So saying, we want to match within a category and for the number of subscribers, and then use that to upgrade the difference estimates. So that's one place we want to take it next, but we just didn't get that far. Yeah, Cristobal?
So, have you looked at what happens with consumption and concentration? Because if there are people going out of the market, I would assume there are going to be fewer videos eventually, but I don't see toddlers watching less Baby Shark anytime in the future. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if, sorry, maybe it's a bit unrelated to your
No,
question?
it is. I mean, actually, it did come up earlier because I think Carl Coleman asked, you know, can we unpack the ad price effect versus the personalization effect? And one of the things that I think might speak to that is the concentration of views by more popular versus less popular channels. So we're interested in speaking to that. It is, you know, this is, it is not so straightforward because there's a direct effect on content, and I'll show you here that it actually varies by channel size, and so, you know, there's a supply effect and a demand effect, but they're plausibly sequenced so that we may be able to provide something that convinces some people there.
And relatedly, I'm also trying to think what's are going to be the substitutions, like the long term, because I also think there is not going to be fewer people interested in advertising. You just lost a tool of using programmatic to reach those audiences, and I would assume that the natural substitution is like doing non-programmatic or matching on other things, which again I think could benefit like larger publishers that are well known, because from the side of the advertiser, like if you want to reach these audiences, maybe I'm not going to advertise with the like new small content creator that nobody knows, but I'm going to advertise with the, I don't know, like Ryan Toys reviews that everyone knows. And so maybe there is something in this regulation that's going to benefit larger known content creators versus not known content creators, as you lose the ability to use programmatic to target.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. So I'll say that this setting is going to be a little bit different because YouTube is a closed platform, so it's not actually traditionally programmatic in the traditional sense. Like I can't go in and decide that Tommy's Toys is really performing better, so I'm going to pivot more advertising there. Advertisers are going in and kind of saying, Google, here's my $50,000. Spend it, here's the sort of targeting I want to do. So there is, one dimension is like you could target a list of creators, and it's not clear to me how much advertisers are using those options. But yeah, that's a good point too, that we should qualify if we find any sort of concentration effects, that some of that could be coming from that story. But I think of the more of what's going on there is like, I know for the very top channels, I forget the name of, there's this like 12-year-old that is like one of the richest people on earth because he's got this massive YouTube channel, and this person now has like TV channels. He's got a media empire. So that this is not, he has other sources of revenue to fall back on. Okay, so here I'm just splitting the channels in terms of quartiles, in terms of the number of total views that they have. So there's probably room to cut this data more, but what we see is the smallest channels, there's a reduction of about 14%. The second quartile is 17%. The third is 18%, and the largest channels see a reduction of about 5 or 6%, but it's not statistically significant. So, I think we have more to do to really convince ourselves of these results. But if we take these at face value, then we might say, hey, over here, maybe it's this diversified revenue story. Could be part of the story here. And then maybe the fact that this is lower, to the extent that those differences are significant, maybe we're starting to get to more hobbyists that are less kind of responding to advertising prices. But this is just speculation. Okay, so it really is possible for a 20-minute presentation to go for an hour. I didn't believe it when I saw everybody else's talk, but we made it happen here too. So, what's going to happen next year? So, I hope that I've convinced you, these are preliminary results, but I hope that we've provided some robust evidence that there's a reduction on the order of 10% in Made for Kids video releases on this platform. And then there's evidence of this pivoting story that's easier for mixed producers than for pure MFK producers. So there is, some result from this feared COPPAcalypse here. In the future, I think that there's a lot of work to do. A lot of these kind of questions, some of these things have actually come up in our discussion already, but we want to look more about quality measures. So a simple one is just likes per view. One story which I think is potentially really interesting, though takes a lot of work to dig into, is the share of content that's original. So we know anecdotally that that this 10% figure may overstate the amount of original content that's being created, because we know anecdotally that some creators, in the face of their revenue plummeting, basically they re-released old content in the form of compilations. So, you know, this 10% may overstate kind of the reduction in original content that's being created post-COPPA. So then we want to look at this user demand story, so views by channel, and we've talked about the concentration that could be interesting there. We want to look at heterogeneity by content and channel types, so dig more into the size and category results. I personally think that a language story may be a really interesting thing to explore here, and the thinking here is that if you're creating, like, you know, content in French for a US audience or in Mandarin for a US audience, there's probably not a lot of great ways to fund that, at least, you know, on TV or something like that. You're kind of depending on YouTube to be able to fund this kind of content, so we might see a larger impact there. And then, you know, finally, on top of, I already sort of said that we want to consider some other upgraded different approaches. We also want to gather more data. So we're going to expand this to the full world and all categories, and so that should give us more power and more insight, we hope. So any more questions?
Well, before we thank Garrett, then, let me just announce the second word of the session: horseback. Thank you very much, Garrett.